Souls-likes need to change. And that might be a controversial statement to some of you. Some of you might think that I'm saying that they've run their course, that they're not good anymore, or something like that, when that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they desperately need to evolve. In other words, we can't just go to Elden Ring 2. And hopefully I can explain why by the end of this video. This is a very big topic, and these are all of the things that we will be covering in this video. From the problems with escalation, the history of FromSoftware and how they leave clues and how they normally like to iterate over the entire course of them as a studio, what problems the formula keeps presenting that become more apparent over time, and in what direction they could potentially go, basing it on the evidence that we have. And then at the very end, I want to talk about how I think that FromSoftware is now transitioning into a different kind of studio, a different kind of developer, following a lot of the trends that are happening in Japan that are some of the better trends within the general gaming industry. So hi, I'm Mugthief, and once again, big video talking about a lot of things. If you can, drop a like. It helps out immensely. And the first point here is that the overall mechanics, the back end of how Souls-likes work, has been stretched out way too thin now. The general bones, the skeleton of how a Souls game works, the way that you move, that you jump, that you explore and interact with things, has just been getting larger and larger over time without a lot of the back end of how mechanics work being changed in order to support that. If we take a look from Demon Souls all the way to Elden Ring, there is still a very identifiable core, a skeleton of the game there, and how the character moves, how you attack, how you interact with things, but everything around that has been built up and expanded upon so much without a lot of what is still at the core of the games changing. And there is only so much of that that you can do before reaching a limit where you are just blocking yourself off from progressing in design and having to fall into very dangerous patterns of design. Shadow of the Erdtree exemplifies this really well. But before that, I want to take a moment to explain how that escalation of things harms the game so much as they keep progressing because of one very important rule in game design. That is that you have to design around the toolset of the player. And for this, I have prepared a series of illustrations, flexing my incredible artistic muscles. If we take a look at something like Dark Souls, the toolset that the player has is quite limited. And while there are still other things that aren't covered here in this image, with stuff like consumables or some of the spells available in Dark Souls like Pyromancy, it's overall a very limited moveset around which you can design your enemies. As we progress and we move into Dark Souls 3, where we have bigger changes like the overall speed of the game, the complexity of some of the movesets, and especially weapon skills in the Ashes of War, and incorporating more spells, it's still a pretty limited toolset, and they can design accordingly. However, once we reach something like Elden Ring, the toolset has been expanded so much that it becomes much more difficult to design bosses around it. The fact that Elden Ring has needed to be patched so many times with things buffed and nerfed is because FromSoftware couldn't anticipate just how many things could absolutely break the game. Because there are so many things in the game and so much flexibility in how the player can express themselves that at the end of the day, many different combinations can trivialize what the game is. And that is, of course, incentivized by the open design of the game. This is where Elden Ring, despite being very beloved and most people really liking the game, and Shadow of the Erdtree, has a bit of an identity crisis because it still wants to be this very challenging traditional Souls game, but heading in a new direction, more of an RPG that's open and allows you to fulfill certain fantasies by making things like a pure spellcaster more viable, or a mixture of a holy knight with all of your faith spells, for example. But you have to remember that when you give the player all of these different tools, you also need to design the bosses around it. And in the case of base Elden Ring, those bosses were not designed for every possible contingency. In my opinion, Shadow of the Erdtree, for as much as it tries to shut down a lot of the different playstyles that appeared in Elden Ring, and it does so by making the bosses more immune or designing them around countering some of those playstyles. In their attempt to counter the existing ones, they have only achieved the same problem again. These bosses have so much health, they deal so much damage, they move so fast, they play so aggressively, they have such high poise that it's surprising to me that they didn't make them immune to most status effects to boot. They dash all over the place, have attack chains that are 5, 6, 7 attacks long. They have frequent desperation moves where they become basically untargetable as they jump into the sky and explode the entire arena, and this is done as a reaction to all of the tools that the player has from base Elden Ring. How can we increase the challenge of something to players that have such a varied tool set in order to tackle the challenges we place in front of them? And one of the easiest solutions is to make a lot of those things less effective. In that process though, making them so difficult and countering so many of the playstyles means that taking them on normally is not really viable anymore. I encourage anybody who doesn't believe me to just go and fight the bosses with a straight sword. No crazy busted ashes of war, no exploits, no sorceries, no mimic tier, just you dodging in a straight sword, which is a viable playstyle all throughout Elden Ring. No shields either, because a great shield still works and trivializes the entire DLC in case you're still stuck on it. It's not that it's impossible to beat Shadow of the Erdtree with a straight sword, it's that it's just patently unfun. These bosses are not designed to be tackled this way. They are so overloaded that it seems that the intended solution to their difficulty is to build craft around them and take advantage of every single tool that in the base game was more of an option. You need to buff yourself, you need to have your weapons tip-top, take advantage of status effects, or take advantage of poise breaks. You need to find some way to slightly cheese these bosses in order for them to feel like a fair fight. Where before, most of them were tuned around being a fair fight for a player that didn't use Ashes of War and just wanted to two-hand a weapon and roll through attacks. But of course, because they were tuned for that, everybody using all of the tools could trivialize them. So now we've escalated. We're one step above. And I feel like the tipping point of that is basically here. I think it's a very small percentage of players, maybe around 20%, that can get through Radahn, the Promised Consort, without using cheese. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that is their design, if that's what they intended and what they expect, that's fine. Good for them. But we're starting to reach percentages, especially in a game that was designed with a lot of accessibility in mind, that are very low. The skill requirements for how overloaded these kits and the damage stats can get is, frankly, absurd at this point. So progressing from here would mean making a boss that's more challenging, more of a spectacle than Radahn. So let's play a little game. Imagine that Radahn is Marika, and Shadow of the Erdtree contained a separate boss fight on par with Millennia, but scaled up to the DLC. How many people do you think could clear that without cheese? This is escalation, and an Elden Ring 2 would have to fall into that. And it all comes back to designing around the toolset that you give players. A great example of this is Bloodborne, where we have Lady Maria, for many people, including myself, the greatest boss that FromSoftware has ever done. And it's because you fight on even footing. It feels like a dance, like she has access to the same tools as you, you're just two very capable fighters. Now obviously Elden Ring gives you all of these different tools and the developers want you to use them, but the base game wasn't designed around that. It was designed around the idea that everybody could kind of modify the game in different ways depending on your loadout to take on the bosses. If you wanted to tackle the game like it was Dark Souls, you could, and if you wanted to take advantage of absolutely everything that the game gave you, you could. But now that we're heading in the direction where the developers want you to use all of the tools, it starts to get farther and farther away from that original design, from what Dark Souls has always been, and that isn't a bad thing. But it's a different thing that comes with this very important problem of escalation and future design of these games. And so we now ask the question, where are we headed to from here? And I think that the frustration that a lot of people have had with the bosses, be that because they invalidated their previous playstyles or just because of their design, even if they're tackling them with characters that don't get their playstyles invalidated, speaks to how this escalation in design is just not fun. It doesn't lead to satisfying bosses where you feel happy that you defeated them. It leads to bosses where you feel relief that it's over. And yes, sure, once you memorize all of their patterns and you have a really good build, once you adapt to the new rules of the game, you can go and blow through them easily. I'm on my 3rd playthrough of the DLC and the bosses are basically incredibly easy except Radahn. But that's still part of the problem. I've adapted to this and I can now beat them even if they are less fun than they were before. How would you escalate from here? Because I'm sure I could adapt to whatever comes next, but would it be even less fun? So from here, there's only 2 real paths they can take. The first one is to continue the design trends of Elden Ring, be that open world or how much freedom the player has and how expansive that toolset is, but design the entire game around that freedom much more than they did in Elden Ring in order to avoid some of the situations they've been in. However, there is historically a very clear situation that happens when you give players this much freedom in their toolset, and that is you have to design for all of those different things, which means you can't really make highly specialized, very cool fights. You resort to other simpler mechanics, you know, big damage sponge enemies type of stuff. You end up getting MMO mechanics as you pump your preferred style of DPS into them. But it's FromSoft, so maybe they can figure something cool out, but it does need to change the way that the game plays, the way that the tools are implemented, the ways that you upgrade, the ways that you choose your playstyle. I know a lot of people have a strong aversion to this, but classes might need to actually be classes to implement more passives, to cater more directly towards those playstyles, because having specialization in those playstyles would make the game much easier to balance around as well. Keep that in mind. Anything that is just super flexible means that the design has to be more and more difficult to accommodate on the enemy side and the general game side. But if you broke it down into 5 classes like heavy, assassin, mage, priest, and something else, you could then kind of limit within those classes, and then you could design a tighter game knowing that they will come in with one of those 5, for example. Not saying that's what should happen, by the way. Anytime I speak on something like this, people are like, your idea sucks. And it's like, well, it's an idea. You get the good ideas by throwing stuff out and then iterating on it. Here, I just want to give an example. The other way to progress is by restricting the tool set once again, which is something that they've done. I used the example of Bloodborne before, and I didn't use an example of Sekiro because I couldn't draw. But if you think about it, Sekiro is definitely the game that has the most restricted toolset. Despite what flexibility is in the game for you to kind of use some of the different items and the prosthetics and things like that to take on some of the bosses, really you just have a very basic limited set of attacks. You do have some cooler attacks to give some flavor to things, but really you're just parrying, you're just deflecting everything and then doing the counters when they show up. And because the game asks this very specific skill set of you that is very limited and designed around it, it can push you and tell you, you need to master this. You can't get around this in a different way, but because they know how difficult it is, they did give you some cheat options for those who can run around and find the right items and figure out which enemy can be weak to which thing. But the expectation within the design is for the player to master the mechanics that the game puts forth, because it's just this very limited set. Instead of, I don't know, figure it out, find a magic cannon. And From has always done this, which is why the history supports it. They have a model, they have an idea, and then they evolve on that model, be it their first-person dungeon crawling all the way back with Kingsfield and Shadow Tower, be that the way that they transitioned a little bit into third-person with Evergrace, or how they experimented with more JRPG mechanics, or with their transition to Demon Souls, which is very much just translating those first-person dungeon crawlers into a third-person, slightly more action-based game, but still very, very faithful to their older games, and how it's evolved from there, how they've toyed with it, how they've restricted toolsets with things like Bloodborne and Sekiro, or how they have expanded on the freedom and what the player can do in Elden Ring. They play around with concepts, they implement them, and then they iterate. So I don't think that they would do an Elden Ring 2 without having something important to change it. I have more evidence for this, but it'll come at the end of the video. But before we progress, I do want to throw out that maybe there's more things about this formula that needs to be changed. More than just the framework of moving your character around, maybe more than just the concept. There's bigger design trends here that I think are getting stale. Maybe my expectations were too high, and I'm not saying that I don't enjoy the game regardless, but for the first time, pretty much ever, when playing Shadow of the Erdtree, I did feel like, oh wow, you put a little shiny item at the end of the hallway? I bet it's gonna be a smithing stone 1, because all you want me to do is run in the room so I get ambushed. What a surprise, this has never happened before. Ooh, I bet this floor is gonna crumble. Exciting. Even the infinite drops that are in the game, like the ones in the Ring City, you're like, yeah, I've seen this before. The archetypes of the bosses are starting to get stale and are just being evolved on for the sake of escalation, with that consistent requirement of being more challenging and more flashy than the ones before. But it's a lot of dudes on horse, it's a lot of humanoid duels, and then you start to see a lot of the same repetition throughout bosses as they iterate, but they never really nail it because of the situation they are in. There's only so much of our life that we can spend running around rooms, swinging our swords in search of illusory walls. That's what I'm getting at. There are just things within the Dark Souls design that, while excellent, do need to be refreshed and have a spin on it, because I feel like we've seen the same trick like 50 times now. Maybe not everybody. I know a lot of people came in with Elden Ring, and that's perfectly fine. Please go and enjoy the other games as well. I envy you. I wish I could play them for the first time myself. But those tricks, they really are just getting stretched thin. I think it's one of the reasons why Sekiro and Armored Core to me are so amazing, because they keep a lot of the philosophy and the ideas of the Souls games, but they apply it in very, very different ways that feel so fresh, and the mechanics are so different that there, when I'm exploring or looking for secrets or understanding how the lore works or how the different endings are, that feels so much more exciting than the same framework of the Dark Souls games repeated over and over again. And I think that if I feel it, they know it. At least they're aware of it. It's different if they're going to choose to act on that, but I think I would appreciate it greatly, and I would love to hear your thoughts below. Once again, I would lap up another Elden Ring, same tropes, same things, all over again, no question. But I do feel like some of these tricks are wearing thin. So where do we go from here? Well, I've already talked about the trends that FromSoft has. I've been studying them for the last year, preparing for my FromSoftware retrospective. We can take a lot of information from Miyazaki in interviews, like for example, he recently said that not every game that they make is going to be open world just because of Elden Ring now. He's also said that his favorite aesthetic, his favorite vibe to work in was Bloodborne, and there's certain things of their design that they've doubled down on throughout time, and certain things that they did and then abandoned that are actually returning in Shadow of the Erdtree. One of the interesting details is that of the 8 new weapon classes in the game, all 8 of them are considerably more mechanically complex, or at least have a flourish to them, than the previous ones. You could even argue that the Smith script weapons count. Of course, things like the light greatsword being able to move between its R1 and its R2 seamlessly in the combos, or things like the great katana and the perfumes, which within themselves have interesting movesets, but they have the dodge attack where you charge and then you press dodge and you have a unique attack. The overwhelming speed of things like the backhand blade, or the mobility that is introduced with something like the claws, or the very fast hitting, quite unique movesets of both of the hand-to-hand weapons. And of course, the mixture of offense and defense that is proposed with the thrusting shields. All of these things hint towards a little bit more mechanical complexity in the basic combat of wielding a weapon, which I think is very interesting. Similarly, the fact that we have a talisman that increases cast speed to the maximum, I still don't think it's actually efficient for the price, especially because like the differences depends on the spell, obviously, but the difference between low cast speed and high cast speed on a lot of spells is not much, but might hint towards the fact that if they want to keep speeding up the games, casting needs to change along with it, which would be a very interesting thing. And the hints towards speed and complexity in movesets could indicate that if they're aware of just how much the escalation has ruined some of the boss design, they are moving more towards mechanically complex weapons, which is not new for them. Bloodborne still has the most mechanically complex weapons in the series. Oh, but they don't have weapon skills. Weapon skills are... I don't really enjoy weapon skills as much as many people. Like, you get used to them, but I don't find weapon skills to be that much of an engaging system. It's just, you have a resource. They wanted to have a secondary resource that people actually used with their mana, with their FP. So they tied very interesting and powerful skills to them so that you manage resources and look for openings on what is most of the time your strongest attack on that weapon. I think the ashes and placing them on weapons and having that flexibility, changing the scaling of weapons can be very fun. And when it works, it's incredible and has a lot of flexibility, but they do generally end up on the side of there are some really strong ones and there are some weapons with unique ashes that become the entire weapon. The only reason this weapon exists is for people to press L2, and that I'm not that big of a fan of. But Bloodborne actually had very interesting movesets to learn in the way that the weapons transformed and how they could switch between and how that would extend certain attacks or how each different motion value of those weapons was. I felt like the mechanical depth of each of the weapons in their moveset in Bloodborne was much closer to something like Monster Hunter. It's not Devil May Cry, it will probably never be Devil May Cry. Shoutouts to Otogi, for those who like Otogi though. But it was deeper in understanding your moveset and the situations in which you could use each of those things. And the changes of the movesets in Shadow of the Erdtree hint towards that. Not to the depth that I would like, but it is better. I think there's a very large potential of complicating, of making the movesets have more depth. That could add a lot of raw engagement into the fights, a lot of spectacle, in the same way that you might preemptively start combos to hit an enemy in a game like Monster Hunter. To do something like that within a FromSoft game, or how it could be better planned around certain spells if they're more restricted, I think that could be really cool, and they are hinting towards it. Hello, it is I, Editing Mug. I wanted to clarify some of the stuff I said about complexity in movesets, because I think that it's something that we kind of throw out, but it's not something that we really explain, and while a lot of people probably intuit it or just feel it, other people probably don't. So, very simple breakdown. At the end of the day, what you want to do is hit the opponent, do damage until they're done, right? But how you do it matters a lot, and your options of what you can do to deal damage to them can be very different. The first step of this is called mechanical complexity, which is basically making it so that it requires more inputs, more of a mental process in order for you to react correctly in a situation in order to deal damage. For example, if you take a game like Monster Hunter, a monster can start an attack and you can predict how far away it'll land, and you then might have to calculate very quickly, very intuitively, once you become one with your weapon, how far you are going to be able to move towards the monster during the recovery period, and depending on the distance that you will be from the monster, you have an optimal attack that will be able to hit the monster in the best area given your circumstance. You can obtain an optimal result, or you might not do it correctly. That move might have more complex inputs in order to execute, so you might obtain a lower result. But the fact that there is a better result and that you have to do all of these calculations and know your weapon in order to take advantage of each situation is mechanical complexity. The easiest way to show this in the Souls games is if an enemy in Bloodborne dodges away from you and you just swing R1 and the enemy is just too far away, well, that's it. But if you know that in your current weapon string, transforming it in that moment will give a hit that extends the range, you could continue applying pressure. And these are things that normally we don't see very often in Elden Ring or in Dark Souls, where the movesets are much more standardized and they have access to less moves that are more specific to certain situations, like if an enemy were jumping above you, or to your right, or to your left, or where it would track, or more distance. It's normally just like, yeah, you have your light attack string and your heavy attack string, and you can react with those. That's why things like Milady, or sorry, the light grade swords are exciting, because the fact that you can naturally transition from your R1s to R2s means that if you know where you are in your attack chain, changing it adds different properties that could suit a situation better. Anyways, thanks, I look like a mess. I look like a mess before, I look worse, editing mug out. They also hint in general to a much darker atmosphere, which again is what Miyazaki has said he likes the most, so that is probably a given, that we're headed towards something darker, probably. This game even flirts very directly with survival horror, if you want to call it that, or at least with traditional horror, in the way that it takes away your resources during the abyssal woods. You lose access to torrent. You can recover it. I've seen people act like the abyssal woods you can't use torrent. You can definitely use torrent. You just gotta... There's certain sections where you can use torrent, and you can take out the monsters and use torrent. But the way that those monsters can be taken out, which is really fun, but you don't have your mobility and you can't attack. Your resources are taken away and you have to navigate this area having been stripped of everything that would make you feel comfortable, was a really interesting move that I see a lot of people talking about it like it's just a gimmick that they thought up and because they didn't know what to put in the abyssal woods. And I think that that area is dripping with so much atmosphere that that sounds dumb. It seems like something that was very clearly planned, that they wanted to do something that would be a big surprise and would set up Midras Man. Anyway, sorry for the tangent. So to me, looking at their last 3 games and where they've progressed and what they've been doing with their movesets, their combat, their design, their atmosphere, I think they really improved the world design here, but they didn't know how to fill it in because it's a DLC. Well, again, very big video on the progression and the problems I have with Shadow of the Erdtree that you can go watch if you want to. But there's one more trend I think is really important and that supports my favorite theory of where we're going next, and that's how much they've implemented really impossible spaces. I have a video coming up that I've been working on for a long time. Friends of the channel will tell you how much I bug them about this and about writing this script. FromSoft in general is really good at creating a world that's very grounded and then breaking everything, and they do that throughout time. If you think of something like Ash Lake in Dark Souls 1, or the Painted World of Ariamis, or if you think of the Iron Keep in Dark Souls 2, or Archdragon Peak in Dark Souls 3, or if you think about most of the tail end of Sekiro, although that is grounded in mythology. And in Elden Ring, of course, you can look at something like the infamous Shofra River, and a lot of Shadow of the Erdtree has a very dreamlike feel to it in general. So they like experimenting with bigger and more diverse areas that maybe don't necessarily fit cohesively into one environment, which makes that dreamlike effect of them more potent because they're like, well, I don't care if it doesn't fit, we're gonna put it in because it's cool. Also, the Dark Souls 3 DLCs in their entirety are like that as well. For me, we're due for a return to Shadow Tower, and for those of you who don't know, Kingsfield is kind of the prototype for what would become the Soul series, but Shadow Tower was the sister series. Very similar first-person dungeon crawler, different aesthetic, different vibe, different concept with it being a tower, and especially Shadow Tower Abyss for the PS2 is an incredible game that has this idea of you're in a tower, but each of the different branches or each of the different floors of the tower is just a completely different world where they can go absolutely crazy. From Dracula's castle to alien things, like literally feel like they were taken out of the movie Alien, a lot of H.R. Giger type of stuff, to ant and bug world, like as if you were made of a miniature and you're fighting ants, to the prototype of what would become all of their Archdragon Peak-like areas, be that the area in Dark Souls 2 or in Dark Souls 3 Archdragon Peak, or the jagged peaks in Shadow of the Erdtree. That entire vibe was first done in Shadow Tower Abyss. At least in the FromSoft chronology, I mean. Actually, maybe it's Evergrace. I need to check the release date on those. Actually, it would be Evergrace. But Shadow Tower Abyss also had guns, and it didn't have Estus flasks or something like that. It was still operating on the old rules of consumables and shops and being well prepared before you ventured out. It's a wild game that I strongly recommend people play. It's really cool. There's a world of dinosaurs. There's a dinosaur world. It's awesome. I think something like that, like returning to the structure of Shadow Tower, could really let them spread their wings and experiment with a lot of things, which I think is where they should go to. And if it's not going to be something more mechanically complex, more Bloodborne to Monster Hunter adjacent, and restricting the tool set in that way, and if it's not going to be in the very open reinterpretation of Elden Ring to make the mechanics, the back end, fit better with that complete and total freedom, I think that where we're headed to is something more survival horror. And it's a genre that I would like to see them tackle. Something that they've always flirted with. A lot of your resource management is always something very important within the Souls games. The consumables and the crafting that we see in Elden Ring is definitely a big hint that they like the idea of having very powerful items that can be used sparingly to get out of situations. And if you combine that with something like Shadow Tower Abyss and their use of guns, even the use of ammo or very special weapons that have limited resources to them, I think would fit everything that they need to do to kind of explore in a different direction while still being within the Souls-like formula of something more survival horror-like. Just ramp up the tension to 100. They would have to find a way to make it challenging and fun to do despite whatever else of the mechanics is happening, especially if they go too hard in the survival horror direction. And I think something like Shadow Tower could fit pretty much any one of these different concepts. Now, it could also just be Sekiro 2, and also Armored Core 6, the revision of it, I guess should exist. They've always done revisions of Armored Core games, so I don't know why they would stop now. I mean, to be honest, it just fits that they either return to something long forgotten from their catalog, or at least in concept, not necessarily in name, but a completely new IP is something that they like to do, right? They've kept Dark Souls, and as much as we want to consider it a different IP, let's be honest with ourselves, Elden Ring, while separate lore-wise, is a direct continuation of the Souls series. But Bloodborne and Sekiro were these offshoots that we thought could continue in time, but they didn't. So they might just go with a new IP again. I really don't think that we're gonna get Bloodborne 2 though, and I am still incredibly angry that so many people were introduced to FromSoft with Elden Ring, and that Bloodborne is still trapped in console exclusivity, and even if you can play it on PS5, it's still this 30 FPS game. It hasn't gotten any patches. It really needs a PC port because I just want more people to play it. That's just how much I like that game. Also, it would make them a lot of money. I don't know what they're doing. But I hope I've painted a picture of the problems with that escalation and how they need to redesign and rethink a lot of the things that make this genre what it is, and how they have to work towards it, and the different options that they have, which are a lot of different options to tackle this problem and evolve the series. Not because I think they're going to do a specific one, or because I'm some guy who knows things, because I don't, but for you to get excited and hopefully to understand where the issues are and why we need that change. But to wrap it all up, let's talk about FromSoftware as a developer. So they recently upgraded, they opened a new studio in Tokyo, and they did that with the intention of ramping up more production on more titles at the same time. This falls in line with a lot of Japanese thinking at the moment. We have Miyamoto talking about leaving even more responsibilities and more creative duties to the next generation, because we heard Aonuma talk a lot about that with the development of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, about how the torch needs to be passed and more ideas need to be experimented with. Nintendo currently is the king of experimentation. We've seen a very large boom of more creative and less budget intensive games existing within the industry at the moment. The rise of AA, and Nintendo takes advantage of that because they've always made these smaller AA games. It's just that because they always apply the Nintendo Code of Polish, they also charge you $60 for it. But things like the upcoming slate of Nintendo games, be that The Legend of Lonk that is coming up, or Mario and Luigi, which would have been a handheld game but now it's on Switch, are great examples of this. The teams over at Square have kept talking about creativity and refocusing and really hammering down what projects they do, but at the same time they've talked a lot about how creativity and a lot of the design decisions and the projects that have to be taken over need to belong to younger parts of the company and have more fresh ideas in order to innovate and keep up with the times. I think FromSoftware is in a very similar boat, creating more studios so that they can work on more projects that gives them the freedom to experiment and do cool things with that FromSoft coat of polish that we've come to expect from them. That means, by my estimates, there are 3 to 4 different FromSoft projects currently in the works. And in case you didn't know, this is the longest that we've gone without FromSoft announcing something. FromSoft's output is really, really high-paced. So the longest that we have ever gone without them releasing a big game is 3 years, which is what there was between Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro. And then we had Elden Ring 3 years after Sekiro. Then we had Armored Core 6 come out 2023. Now we have Shadow of the Erdtree. But 2022 to 2025 makes a lot of sense in their release schedule. So would 2024 actually, but that doesn't seem likely. What I'm getting at is they have a lot of stuff that is in production and that will be coming out soon. And a lot of it has to be aware of Elden Ring and Armored Core as the most recent ones, as well as Sekiro. So who knows how many things they're working on and what they could be. We should be prepared to receive a slate of different games from them, unless some of them were just completely canned or assimilated into a different project during production. But having 3 to 4 different projects active at any time, as much as people like to pray at the altar of Hidetaka Miyazaki, is incredibly exciting, because who knows what they're actually going to come out with and what it's going to be like. I have already placed my bets on where I think at least some of these projects will head in, and I do believe that we will see something more combat focused, something more survival horror focused, which again, it runs through the entire series that we have today, but it even runs through some of the more classic games, like Shadow Tower has a lot of that survival horror element, but of course, things like Echo Knight are very much just straight up survival horror kind of visual novels. There's a lot going on here within the main themes that they do, being Souls-likes, horror, mechas, and ninjas, essentially. But hopefully something completely new, because that's really, really exciting to me. Hopefully it's also exciting to you. And if you came out of this video more informed about game design and the history of FromSoftware and where they might be headed and why, and you hopefully understood some of the issues that facilitate the title of this video being something along the lines of Dark Souls or FromSoftware or something needs to change, hit the like button. And if you made it all the way to the end of the video, do me a favor, head down to the comments section. Leave a comment that includes the words "for the love of," and then whatever you want, and I will heart every single comment that does so, because yes, I do read every single comment. If you want more from me, remember to subscribe, and extra special thanks to my patrons, which go the extra mile in supporting me and helping me achieve this stream. Huge shoutouts to Mika, Eastlar, Kite Jr., Alf, Fluffy, Alex, Silent Strike 46, Rapid, Provocatse, Justin, and Noria. A huge thank you to the now 30,000 subscribers, which is crazy to me. I did not expect when I started this channel a year ago that we would be here. I promise to keep improving, to keep learning, to keep making better and better videos. I have no idea what I'm doing, to be completely honest, but I'm doing my best. That you can be sure of. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you again very soon.